What do we do with the mad that we feel? In 1997, Mr. Rogers asked this question to the world on his PBS show, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. He's saying, what do we do with the mad that we feel when the whole wide world seems oh so wrong and nothing you do seems very right? What do you do? I think of this song when I read John 11 and the story of Lazarus dying. The entire chapter is framed within the same story. Jesus visits Mary and Martha, Lazarus' sister, 4 days after he dies, and then he resurrects Lazarus. Now, we're only looking at just a small section of the story today because, honestly, it's a really long story. And also, because of that moment in the middle, that moment when Martha meets Jesus, looks him in the eye, and we see her character unfold in ways that no other gospel portrays. In anguish, Martha cries in verse 21, "Lord, if you would have been here, my brother would not have died." Perhaps the most gut-wrenching statement in the entire Bible. Lord, if you would have been here, my brother would not have died. Whether we're willing to admit it or not, we too know the sting of this kind of confession. And Lord, if you would have been here, my brother or sister or mom would not have died. I mean, you know the families in Australia and Madagascar and Mozambique and Malawi are all saying this when Cyclone Freddy hit just a few weeks ago. Lord, if you would have been here. Or all the families in Sao Paulo who experienced the most rainfall in a single day in Brazil's history, 24 inches, causing catastrophic mudslides. Lord, if you would have been here. Or the earthquakes in Turkey and Syria, or the California storms, or tornado victims, or the families suffering from the Ukraine and Russian war, or cancer, or heartbreak we experience every day. Lord, if you would have been here, my family, brother, husband, friend, community, town, wife, mom, child would not have died. I mean, in anguish, Martha cries, Lord, if you would have been here, my brother would not have died. And it's not like Jesus had a good excuse to give her. I mean, Jesus is the guy who we're told he heals a paralyzed man after 38 years just by telling him to pick up his mat and walk. Jesus is the guy who meets a blind man and heals him with mud. He healed a kid from across town. He told his parents, go home, your son's made well. I mean, Jesus is a healer, and Mary and Martha know it. And so when you think it couldn't get worse for them, what we see next is that which we wish we could unsee. In verse 6, we read that Jesus never actually intended to go. Verse 6. After having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place that he was. That's hard to hear. Moments unfold in life in ways that we don't always understand. Sometimes it's painful, and it leaves us wounded. Sometimes we cry and we question God. And I need you to hear me say, that's okay. But don't get upset with Jesus too fast, because look who he does with Martha. And this is so important. He takes all of her anger, her sadness, listens to it. He doesn't speak back. He doesn't even shut her down. He doesn't overshadow or belittle her feelings. He doesn't make himself the victim. He doesn't talk at all. He lets her protest. He makes room for her pain. And this is still true today. If you're in pain, you most definitely can take your frustration and anger to God. God can take it. And actually, there's so much engagement with Martha in this story, it's easy to miss that in verse 32, Mary gets her moment with Jesus too. Both Mary and Martha have private moments in this story, and they actually say the same sentence. Lord, if you would have been here, my brother would not have died. This just shows me that Mary and Martha's grief they're not that different. It actually stirs from the same place in their soul. I mean, keep in mind, they're sisters of Lazarus. Martha runs to the edge of town to meet Jesus, but Mary can't. She's stuck in the house. She can't get out the door, which tells me that her grief, although it comes from the same place, it manifests differently. This could be true for us and our families and even our church. When pain hits us at the our story level, we need different things at the my story level. And thankfully, Jesus bears the capacity and even the compassion to meet both of them in their pain, right where they need him. You know, there's a great deal of theology that's bound up in pain. Theologian Barbara Holmes speaks and writes about theology of pain. She says that we have to admit and own it, enter into it, and when we do, we find God. This is a theological truth, that God meets us in our pain. However it manifests, pain can lead us to God. And what we see next in the gospel story has to be told. And I find this so very important. After Jesus talks to Martha and Mary, it's in that moment he actually does, it's the only time in all the Gospels he does what we read next. He weeps. He takes Martha's righteous anger and Mary's sadness, and he takes their pain and he holds it. He meets them in the midst of it, and he weeps with them. This is compassion. And I think he does the same with us today. And this may be the most important aspect of this entire story. And it's not even the miracle. He's still about to raise a man from the grave. So what this tells me is that when we recognize and own our pain, when we name it, Jesus uses that moment to lead us to God. And that's when miracles happen. In the fall of 2011, Noelle's uncle passed away unexpectedly from a hunting accident. The ripple effect of that moment, it still moves through our family. Uncle Don grew up poor, and one year all of his toys were stolen from his front yard. His parents couldn't afford new ones, so his childhood was colored by the memory of that which was lost. As an adult, every Christmas, Don would fill his house with toys to make sure all of his nieces and nephews had more than enough to play with. Now, we still don't understand why Uncle Don died, or even if he had to. But what we do know is that every Christmas when we pull out those toys from the closet, we're given the solace we need to remember that life isn't about the time we're given. It's actually about God's glory. And we have to remember not to look at the damage that time creates, but the image that's beyond the damage, the image of God that leads us to glory. Just like when Jesus says in verse 4, "But when Jesus heard it, he said, 'This illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it.'" You know, our family glimpses God's glory and how God can heal time when we see our kids belly laugh while playing with Uncle Don's old toys. God's glory is found in the memory and the legacy of Uncle Don. In these moments, our family realizes that we can't just look at the damage that life brings. We have to find the image. And that's the beauty of how John writes his gospel. We see Martha making this same transition from pain to healing. I mean, look at this next section starting in verse 21. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you would have been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him." And Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he'll rise again in the resurrection on the last day." And Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" And she said to him, "Yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world." So, when Jesus and the disciples arrive in Bethany, Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. Martha's now distraught. Mary's beside herself. The town is in mourning, and it's here, precisely when the damage has been done. And Jesus shows up on the scene, and he says, "Now, I'm going in." And the disciples scream, "No, Lord, you can't go in there. Death is in there." And then Jesus winks at them and says, "No, guys, in me, there's only life." I had a professor say once that it's here that Jesus refuses to believe in the atheistic anxiety that says we're running out of time. Jesus arrives as a beacon of light, showing us it's not life that's on the clock, it's death. It's not justice that's been forsaken, it's injustice. It's not hope that's lost, it's despair. Jesus walks right up to Mary and Martha and he says, "I feel your pain. I see your anger. But listen, your brother will rise. And I'm going to do this for God's glory." And Jesus is saying the same to you and me this day. Because when death comes knocking on our door, God is not absent. Even when we don't know what to do with the mad that we feel, God is still here. For it's in our pain that God is acting at God's best. And that's when God is redeeming and resurrecting the time. And this is why church is so important. We're the ones who remind a world who's been damaged by time that it's not life that's on the clock, it's death. It's not justice that's been forsaken, it's injustice. It is not hope that's lost, it's despair. Because Jesus isn't sidestepping or skirting or being flippant with Mary and Martha's request here. He is reauthoring how we think our lives are running out of time, or how we think about God abandoning us in our pain. In both instances, that's now wrong. That's now redeemed. Jesus is standing in the face of time and saying, "I am the Lord of this, and in me, there's only life." One of my favorite sermon stories to tell is about a Manhattan physician. I read about this in the New York Times. Her name was Joyce Wallace. She graduated from Yale, and with her pedigree, she should have had an Upper East Side medical practice. But instead, she drove around traveling in a Ford Econoline van. She spent her days driving around Midtown Manhattan offering medical care to women in prostitution. She would bind up people's wounds, run tests, and offer a word of liberation saying, "You know, you don't have to live this way if you don't want. There's some of us who would help and even support you." The New York Times reporter was somewhat skeptical with Dr. Wallace's life choices and asked her, "Isn't it a little disparaging to know that most, if not all of your patients go on practicing prostitution and then dying with drug overdose or AIDS? Do you ever feel like you're just wasting your time?" Dr. Wallace responded, "Well, that's one way to look at it. But I learned as a child from my mother, who was a special ed teacher her entire career. She always taught me, don't look at the damage. Look at the image. Don't look at the damage that time does to people. Look at the image of God preserved in them for eternity. Don't look thinking you'll see only death. Look beyond it and see the image of God. Don't look at others judging them for what time has done. See through it to the immortal diamonds in which we're all made." Martha and the disciples learned quickly what took a lifetime for Dr. Wallace and even us to learn. That time has a way of damaging all of us. But in Christ, we bear a deeper image. God sees through our damage, cuts through our time, and we find in that moment something everlasting. And we realize that Jesus calls that life.